歡迎大家嚟到酷兒神學公開演講《酷兒基督徹底的愛》，A public lecture on Queer Theology, Christianity and Radical Love。咁就剛才講咗啲翻譯器㗎啦嚇，咁我諗大家清楚咯嗬？有冇唔清楚？有冇人仲冇翻譯器㗎？有這個翻譯知啦嗬？好 ，OK。今晚呢一個公開講座咧，主辦機構咧就係聖神學社，咁而協辦團體咧就係有九龍佑寧堂、基督眾樂教會、基恩之家、酷兒團契、基督路小教會同埋香港基督徒學會嘅。咁我哋喺開始之前呢，我哋想邀請牧師嚟幫我哋做一個簡短嘅祈禱。
慈愛嘅上主，我哋多謝你喺剛過去嘅禮拜五六日有 Amplify 嘅亞洲區同志大會。喺呢個大會之後，我哋今天晚上有聖神學社主辦嘅酷兒神學講座，佢嘅講題係酷兒基督徹底嘅愛。主要讓我哋關心同志性小眾嘅愛火能夠繼續嘅燃點落去。主要我哋都感謝你，讓鄭書祥博士去老遠嘅喺美國嚟到參加 Amplify， 而且繼續嘅留低主理今天晚上嘅講座。主要讓我哋同志們嘅能夠得到 empower 有力量，亦都讓關心性小眾嘅朋友能夠盡心嘅去明白牧養性小眾係教會裏邊一個好重要嘅牧養事工，讓喺教會裏邊被邊緣嘅性小眾朋友得到關懷，得到接納。主聖靈啊，求你帶領我哋今天晚上無論喺主講回應，我哋每一個坐低嘅聽眾都被你聖靈所澆灌，挑旺我哋裏邊嗰團愛火，明白喺基督裏邊嗰個最奧妙嘅道理，就係愛係永不止息嘅。我哋喺呢度一眾同心同德嘅禱告，係奉基督聖名，阿門。
好，唔該晒，卜牧師。首先呢，我就好快、好簡短咁介紹下聖神學社。聖神學社咧係第一次咧，我哋係有一個主辦一個公開嘅講座。咁我哋係為本地嘅教牧同工、信徒領袖同埋個別信徒所舉辦嘅公開活動。咁我哋係好歡迎咧，係有興趣探討性別神學同性小眾團體同埋個人嘅參與嘅。咁聖神學社就係喺09年嗰度嗰陣時開始咧，就係有一群咧好熱愛酷兒神學，就我哋係致力咧就想做一啲本地嘅神學啦，本土化嘅神學人咧成立嘅。咁我哋咧就係致力開拓喺本地嘅酷兒神學。咁我哋就曾經同一啲唔同嘅性小眾嘅團體舉辦咗一啲分享會啊、工作坊啊咁，同埋咧亦都係致力推動呢個同酷兒平權教育嘅同埋出版等嘅工作。咁我哋將會喺今年內會出版我哋有本書叫《人性義》㗎啦。咁我哋其實呢個機構咧，我哋都係一班好似話一啲義工咁嘅即係義務性質咁走埋一齊去創立咗呢個聖神學社。咁我哋好歡迎你哋自由奉獻嚟支持我哋以下嘅工作嘅。好，咁我好簡短咁去介紹我哋嘅講員咧，因為其實應該好多人都對於佢好熟悉嘅，如果有去過 Amplify 嘅 conference。咁我哋今日好高興可以請到鄭書祥博士咧嚟到同我哋呢個公開講座。咁鄭博士係來自美國麻省聖公會神學院。咁佢先後喺哈佛咧有一個法學嘅碩士啦，同埋佢喺紐約嘅協和神學院度咧係得到呢個系統神學博士嘅學位嘅。咁佢嚟到呢一度咧真係好難能可貴。咁鄭博士亦都係咧亞洲酷兒精神嘅創辦者同埋召集人。 咁亞洲酷兒精神呢，就係一個對宗教同埋靈修有興趣嘅亞裔酷兒同埋佢哋嘅支持者而成立嘅國際跨宗教嘅網絡。好啦，咁我哋而家事不宜遲，就邀請喺唔好意思，提你大家將你哋嘅手機校咗佢去靜音先嚇。Would you please turn your mobile phone to a silent mode？ 請你們的手機關了那個聲音嚇。好，可以啦，好。So we'd like to have a warm welcome for Reverend Dr. Patrick Cheng.
Okay, no? Okay, how's this? Here, okay, great. All right. Well, good evening. Thank you so much for coming here tonight, especially on a Monday evening. And I'm going to be speaking tonight on Christianity and radical love, why the church must support sexual and gender minorities. But before I begin, I just wanted to check, is the translation working okay for everyone who has a headset? Can I see a thumbs up? Okay, Reverend Grace is like, yeah, thumbs up. Okay, good, good. All right. Well, I will also be projecting slides over here, so hopefully those of you in the corner over there, you can see okay up here, right? All right, great. So first of all, I just wanted to give some thank yous. So I already thanked all of you for coming here tonight, but I wanted to thank the Queer Theology Academy for sponsoring this lecture. I guess it's the inaugural lecture, correct? And Dr. Rose Wu and Pearl Wong and Joseph Cheng and Laishan Yip and many other people who have been involved with this. I really wanted to thank them for inviting me to be part of this. I also wanted to thank the co-sponsors for this lecture, which include One Body in Christ and Reverend Grace, and also the Blessed Minority Christian Fellowship. I see many faces here from there. Can I hear who's from there is here? Yes. Woohoo! Right, yes, that I've gotten to know. And then also I'd like to thank all of the translators here that have done such a good job, and also the Kowloon Union Church and Reverend Phyllis and Reverend Maggie for sponsoring this space. So basically, what I wanted to talk about tonight is I want to talk about queer theology. And a number of you have been at the Amplify conference, correct? So some of you have already heard some of my conversations about queer theology. But how many of you have heard about queer theology? Can I see, raise some hands if you sort of have heard about it or know a little bit about it? Okay, so about half of you, okay. One of my books is called Radical Love, An Introduction to Queer Theology. And so that book is actually written to introduce this thing called queer theology. And so tonight my lecture is going to be talking a little bit about queer theology and how queer theology, a centerpiece of that theology is that the difference between queerness and Christianity is actually not like this, but it's actually like this. Okay, so that the two are actually two sides of the same coin. And so that will be the overall point of my lecture. And then I'll be speaking for about an hour, and then we'll have the respondents respond to the lecture. So for many of you, I think the idea of putting queerness and theology together is like oil and water, right? Like that the two do not mix, right? That it's sort of, what is he talking about? Is he crazy? I mean, let alone sort of mixing the two. And I think that's it's not unusual, because even in the United States, I've read a lot about what's been going on here in the Hong Kong context, especially with the debate over the consultation and the role of megachurches like the Young Fook Church, I think, that had sponsored a prayer rally in January that was very anti-gay. And then I think this was a photo that was taken there of LGBT activists sort of coming up against the Christian community. So I think in the public imagination, there's often a sense that the two are not compatible, right? They're like oil and water. But I think, my point is that Christianity is ultimately queer. And this is a photograph of those of you that were just over the last few days, we had this Amplify conference. So how many of you were at the Amplify conference? Okay, yeah, a lot of you were there. So this conference, the Amplify conference, was around 300 LGBT, 300 동지 queer Christians that gathered, and we had a wonderful time. And so Christianity is queer in the sense that there are LGBT Christians. There were 300 of us, including allies. And then I think yesterday, after the conference was over, there was actually a press conference by the Big Love Alliance. Anthony Wong was there. And so, I was like, oh, I got to see him in person. It was such a wonderful thing. And then a number of ministers. So not just LGBT Christians, people in the pews, but also ordained folks who are openly queer, openly gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. Am I okay with the translators? Am I talking a little fast, or am I okay? All right, just wanted to check in there. Another reason why Christianity is queer is this wonderful Covenant of the Rainbow petition that's been circulating, that it's not just LGBT Christians, but also allies. So many churches, as well as religious leaders, have gone online to sign this Covenant of the Rainbow to support the rights of sexual and gender minorities in Hong Kong, and to accept them in churches as well as their equal rights under civil law. And so there is that sense that not all of Christianity is opposed to LGBT issues. And finally, even more deeply, though, beyond just sort of the membership of the church, one of the wonderful things that has been happening in Hong Kong is an indigenous, the rise of indigenous queer theology in Hong Kong. And, we have Dr. Rose Wu here, who is the matriarch of queer theology. Her book, Liberating the Church from Fear, is a landmark work. Really, I was just reading it again just a week ago, and it's amazing how fresh it is. You wrote it in the early 90s, mid-90s, is that right? 2000. Okay, all right. So even with 2000, I think some 13, years ago, it's still incredibly relevant and fresh. And then I think just a year or two ago, a special issue of In God's Image, which I think you guest edited also, right? On queer theology in Hong Kong, doing Beyond Right and Wrong, during queer theology in Hong Kong. And as you can see, the interesting thing with queer theologies is that it's sort of moving deeper than just saying, okay, we're showing up, we're sitting in the pews, we're members of the church. People are doing theology from their own particular LGBT context or as allies, right? So there's a lot, in terms of why I believe Christianity is queer, and I will talk more about that for the rest of my lecture. So this is an overview of my lecture, what I'm going to be talking about. I think, I have about 45 minutes until 8:30. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover 4 points. One is I'm going to talk about who I am, to give you a little bit of a context about who I am in terms of my social background, okay? Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about definitions on queer theology, what queer theology is, why we use the term queer theology, right?酷儿文学, right? As opposed to 同志文学, like why queer? And then thirdly, this idea of radical love, which I think is very important, is at the center of queer theology and Christianity. And then fourth, I want to close by talking about the calling of today's churches. What Christian churches, I believe, are called to do today. The calling, the very special calling that all churches have. And so that's what I will end with. Okay? Any questions? Any questions about the format? Does that seem clear? Can I see a head nodding? Okay, yeah, just, okay, good. All right, and you can smile and nod to feedback, and unless you hate what I'm saying, and then you don't have to smile or nod. But that's or if you have any questions, just raise your hand or whatever. So I'll aim to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, great. Let me just. I think there's some water here, right? Okay, great. So. I'm kind of a restless person. I like to wander, so I think, and I like to teach. So yeah, that way I can be amongst you. So I'll put the water there. Great. So who am I? This is not some existential question or, just my dealing with my own identity issues or something. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about who I am, so that you know who I am and why I write the theology that I do. Because I think all of theology is grounded in social context. Anyone that says that theology just has always fallen out of the sky is ignorant or just lying to you, right? Or is wrong, because theology has always been contextual. Even sort of biblically based theologies, they only go back as far as the Reformation, really. I mean, it's a response to medieval theology. So it's important to know where people are coming from. I am a seminary professor. I teach at the Episcopal Divinity School, which is one of the seminaries of the Episcopal Church. How many of you know the Episcopal Church? Some of you, yeah. It's the Anglican Communion. It's the Anglican Church in the United States. And the Episcopal Divinity School is open to all students, but one of our very distinguished alumna is Dr. Rose Wu here, as well as, and my colleague, Dr. Kwok Pui Lan. Kwok Pui Lan teaches, she's my theology colleague at EDS. And Gail Yi, who is an Asian American biblical scholar, she also teaches there. So I'm very proud. We have about 12 members of the faculty, and 4 of us are of Asian descent. We have, Pui Lan, who is, sort of Asian, Asian American. Gail is sort of 3rd generation Asian American, and I'm sort of 1st generation Asian American. So we have, even though we sort of look alike, we come from very different places. And we also have Christopher DeRising, who is South Asian. He's Indian. So it's amazing, right, in the United States with a fairly small faculty that a third of us come from an Asian background, which I think actually represents the population of the world, frankly. So we're really actually just reflecting what it should be. And I actually teach, I call myself the bookends. I teach early church. So one of my classes is the first 800 or so years of the Christian history. And I also teach contemporary theology, so post-1960s theology. And I love to bridge the two, bring the ancient with the new. And I also teach queer theology and queer pastoral care. So I teach a number of classes there. So just to give you a sense of where Episcopal Divinity School is, I think, America, I know for me, like Asia is, before sort of coming here, well, Hong Kong is like Hong Kong or whatever. So just so you can see, right, it's in the Northeast, it's in the upper right-hand corner of the United States. That just gives you a sense of where the seminary is. I'm also a theologian, so I sort of say that I teach so that I can write, right? That sort of pays the bills so I can do my theology. And so the 3 books that I've written all have to do with queer theology. I'm a queer theologian. My first book, Radical Love, is an introduction to queer theology. So it's designed to help teach people what queer theology is. And I'm very excited because Robert was just telling me that I think that this year the comprehensive exams I don't know if I'm going to get Cheng into trouble, but it's, no. Apparently for the BD exam, one of the questions was on queer theology. So clearly it's not sort of just something that's out there too much. My second book is actually on thinking about sin and grace. One of the issues that I've had as a queer theologian is how do we talk about sin and grace in a way that speaks to LGBT people, not to throw it out, but also not to just import it without any changes. So that's a whole book. Anyone that sort of accuses me of ignoring sin, I can say, look, I wrote a whole book on it. So you can't say I don't take it seriously. And then the third book that I've written is called Rainbow Theology. And one of my criticisms of queer theology is that queer theology is very white. Other than sort of like queer Hong Kong theology or contextual theologies, much of queer theology is written by Europeans and Americans. And by that, I mean non-people of color. So this whole book is actually writing about African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino, Latinas, and American Indians, Native Americans, on reflections, queer people of color writing about theologies. I think that's actually a very important thing to write about. So that just gives you a sense of the kinds of work that I've done. And I've been an ordained minister for actually 12 years. I'm ordained with the Metropolitan Community Churches. So I have done pastoral work in addition to seminary work. A lot of my work is grounded in having ministered to LGBT people for over a decade. I also write. I'm a blogger. I write for the Huffington Post. So I also really believe that one of my callings is not just theology in an ivory tower, but to bring theology out into the public so that people can talk about theology. So that's something that's important to me too. So I was actually born in Hong Kong. So some of you who were at the Amplify conference have seen this photo, but that's me clutching the red envelope. And that's my grandmother, my Waipua, who is no longer with us. But so I was actually born, my mother tells me I was born at the Jockey Club Clinic or something. I guess, but I was actually baptized at Rosary Church, just not too far from here. And my parents, my first home was actually at Sim Sha Tsui, and so I actually, but then I moved to the United States when I was 1. So even though I have that tie with Hong Kong, I have basically spent most of my life in the United States. So that's me a little older, not much older. But I've only visited Hong Kong maybe once or twice before this. Last time was '88, so a long time before even the handover. So for me, this is sort of a homecoming. First time, not without my family, my parents or my mother now. And so that's, I was telling the conference that I'm either an ABC, American-born Chinese, right? Or a banana, like the yellow on the outside, white on the inside, right? But I like to think that I'm becoming a little more yellow on the inside too. I don't know about the white on the outside, that doesn't work that way. Anyway, and I'm also, an Asian American theologian, which means I'm an Asian theologian in diaspora, right? That I'm sort of doing theology from an Asian perspective, but I'm not in Asia, right? So it's sort of like the ancient Israelites when they were sort of in exile, in Babylon, and sort of coming back to Jerusalem and sort of being a little disoriented. So I think some of you may have seen, I think it was just yesterday, Ming Bao had a profile of my work. So if you wanted to read a little bit more about my history, but this was a photo they took. They actually took it outside of a restaurant because they like the blessing symbol, right? But I like it too because it's sort of an indigenous Chinese symbol, right? It's sort of the mixture of the Western collar and the Asian symbol, which I think summarizes the hybridity that I try to bring to my theology, right? And I think just being even more self-aware of that is something that is very important to me. So that's just a little bit of a background of myself. One more thing. Boy, that went really fast. So this is my family of choice. This is my, it's my husband and our four-legged daughter, Chartra. Those of you that have dogs probably know, dog people. But Michael and I we've been together for 21 years. And so we'll celebrate our 22nd year in July. He's already mad enough that I've been here for so long, so he's not here. But he said the first thing, you're going to walk the dog for like 2 weeks after you come back. Enough of the dog walking. Yeah, so like gay couples and straight couples, we fight about the same things. It's very boring. There's no different, really. And then Chartres she's almost 4. We named her after the cathedral, Chartres Cathedral in France. So we thought, if we have another dog, we'll name it Reims from the other cathedral in France. We'll name our dogs Cathedral. Anyway, all right. So anyway, that's our family of choice. So I also write from a openly gay partnered, theologian. So I'm not just sort of writing about an abstract. I have over 2 decades of working, relationality within a relationship, same-sex relationship. So queer theology, as you can see, there are a lot of books about queer theology. It's not something that I just made up or is just, this newfangled thing. But you see the picture, you notice like how white the baby and, the Madonna is? It's like what kind of, pictures are very powerful, right? That's why I use PowerPoint, because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so, what does it say when queer theology uses that picture, And then, did you see the subtitle? It says, Rethinking the Western Body. I just don't understand what in the world they were thinking. Like, what, Eastern bodies aren't queer? I mean, it's like, why? What? And in fact, the whole book, it's an anthology. And as far as I know, there is not a single author who is of Asian descent that wrote in this book. And I think there's only 2 pages out of the whole book that deal with people of color, African American queer issues. So I don't think it's intentional, but I do think it is problematic. This is really why, with theology, you have to have voices that write from our own particular context. So the work that's being done here in Hong Kong is very important, as well as hopefully, myself and my colleagues. What is queer theology? So you see, there are all these books on queer theology. The Queer God, right? Religion is a queer thing. I mentioned to people it's a rainbow rosary, right? Like gay and lesbian theologies and controversies in queer theology. These are all books that talk about queer theology. And so let me just define a little bit what the term queer theology is, okay? So you have theos and logos, which are 2 Greek words, right? So that means, for those of you that don't necessarily know Greek, it's theos and logos, which actually just means God and talk, right? So theology is just a fancy word for God talk, talking about God. So anytime you talk about God, you're doing theology. I mean, there's formal theology, but broadly speaking, theology is talking about God. So queer theology is queer talk about God, right? I have the rainbow color here, right? Yeah. And so it's either queer people, LGBT people, queer the people or tones of people talking about God, or allies talking about LGBT people and the queer experience. Does that make sense? Are you following me so far? Okay, good. All right. So the important thing to point out is that, as I mentioned, for as long as we've had theology, all of theology is contextual, right? And especially in the last 50 years. You have the Black Christ, you have the Asian Christ, the feminist Christ. That's actually a statue of Christa, a naked woman who's been crucified. That was very controversial when it came out. You have the Native American Christ. You have the Latina Christ, and women of color Christ. So the important thing is too. Then you have the queer Christ, right? I have Jesus, here with a rainbow loincloth. And so for some people, this may seem somewhat scandalous, but I think it is a good, a good visual picture as to what queer theology is trying to do, that there is a queer Christ too. Why is there a Black Christ, but not a queer Christ? And this is a very powerful painting by an artist. Do you see how the sign above Jesus' head, normally it's INRI, right? Jesus Christ, King of the Jews in Latin. In Roman Catholic churches you have that. It's been replaced with the word faggot, right? Do you see that? So instead of inri, it's faggot. And it's intentionally like someone being crucified for being queer. Like the Matthew Shepard case in the United States. Matthew Shepard was a young gay man who was beaten to death and tied to a fence and left to die on a fence. And a lot of us have said, that is a modern-day crucifixion. To be beaten and to be left to die, and he died. So again, I think this picture is a very powerful visual depiction of what queer theology is. Taking the LGBT experience and saying that theology actually speaks to that experience. Okay? So I think, so one of the things I want to talk about is the title queer. Like why use the word queer, right? Like why queer? And so do any of you have problems with the word queer? Can I raise your hand? Yeah, so a few of you, right? Yeah. And that's the one question that I always get, and I speak all the time, all places. I'd say the number one, it's sort of like Family Feud. Do you have Family Feud here? The TV show where, top answer, oh, okay, never mind. It's lost in translation. There's a TV show where they poll people as to what the top answers are. The top questions I get is, why do you use the word queer? So let me explain that. Why queer, right? Because I think for some people it's a very offensive word. And so there are three reasons. One, it's an umbrella term. Two, it's about transgressive action. And three, it's about erasing boundaries, okay? And so let me just go through each one of those. One, umbrella term. Queer, at least in English, is used to be sort of an umbrella, to refer to all these subcategories. It's a shorthand notion, right? So it includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, questioning, ally, and even asexual and pansexual and two-spirit. So I think in Chinese, 同志 is also sort of like an umbrella term, right? But in English, you can't really use gay to describe all of that because gay usually means gay men. So instead of saying LGBTIQQAAP2, every time I want to say LGBTIQQAAP2 because, you can imagine every time I write or I preach and have to say LGBTIQQAAP2, it's just too much trouble. So queer is just a shorthand way of referring to all that. So that's one reason why a lot of people use the word queer. Second, transgressive action. During the 1980s with HIV/AIDS, there was a lot of activism, like Queer Nation, we're here, we're queer, get over it. There's a sense of anger and reclaiming the word queer. Like when someone calls you a bad name, sometimes when you use that name, it takes away the power or the badness. It's almost like when you can't say a word, it becomes so taboo. It almost takes on more power. I studied under James Cone, who was the father of black theology. He sort of was the creator of black theology. And, in the 60s, black was actually a bad word. It was, people used Negro. That was actually a good term. And he said, black is beautiful, right? Like reclaiming black. And so a lot of people reclaim queer, that queer is beautiful too, So we're here, we're queer, get over it. So there's something beautiful about being transgressive. So that's the second reason why we use the word queer. The third reason for queer is erasing boundaries. And this is the most important reason. There's a whole study called Queer Studies. And Dr. Wong here knows cultural studies and is familiar with all this. And so basically, the critique, the reason why we use queer is the world divides everybody into two boxes, right? A pink box and a blue box. And the boxes happen even before you're born, right? Everyone wants to know, what is it, right? Is it a boy? Is it a girl? Is it pink? Is it blue? So that I can, I can buy the presents, I can decorate the nursery. But there are only two boxes, right? In fact, like I tell many people, that those colors are very sort of culturally determined. In the United Kingdom or in England in the, I think, 18th century, blue was the more feminine color. It was not masculine, so it's interesting. But anyway, I want to challenge the fact that there are only two boxes. Why have only two pairs of shoes? Why not have rainbow sneakers? And I think Nike just came out with Pride sneakers. But anyway, like why not have rainbow sneakers? And I think another example of this erasing boundaries is this, the idea that, look, if you're born in the pink box, the women box, you like Barbie dolls, and then if you are born in the blue box, and the guys, you like football. So I can testify that I do not like football. So amen? Amen. You do like football? Okay, good. See, okay, all right. The Super Bowl, I'm like watching some kind of, whatever, some kind of romantic comedy on TV. So I think one of the challenges of erasing boundaries is gender stereotypes. See, do you see how the boundaries are erased, right? That you cross sort of the lines. That's sort of a sign of queerness. And so that's at the heart of queer theory. Binaries, only two things, and that we're forced to choose two things, and often the two things stem from a sense of gender. And so with that in mind, let me go to this idea of radical love, which is connected to queer theory. Let me just see how we're doing. Good. Radical love. As I mentioned, my first book is called Radical Love, and I use this concept because I think it's key to the notion of queer theology. So what is radical love? Radical love, so pay attention to this slide. I'll have like two slides that you should pay attention to. One is this one. A love so extreme that it erases or dissolves our existing boundaries. Okay, let me say it again. A love so extreme that it erases or dissolves our existing boundaries. So let me give an example. To me, queerness and radical love is like an eraser. Like, see, you have a line, and you've got the eraser that erases the line. And Michael, my husband, you saw, right? Like, when I fell in love with him, 21 years ago, we met through a personals ad, and we had met on a date, and we sort of joked that we have been on the same date. Basically it's a conversation that's gone on for 21 years. We're very blessed that we get along, compatible in many ways. But as our relationship has deepened, the boundaries that separate us as individual people, I'm not just talking about physical boundaries, but I'm talking about emotional and intellectual and spiritual and psychological boundaries. You know how married couples, you can almost finish your sentence, right? Like you say something and you know what the other person is. It doesn't help when you're fighting, right? Because you know what the other person is going to say and you already have a response. And so they already have a response. So basically you have to just call time out, right? But that's what happens when boundaries get erased, right? I mean, and so there's something wonderful about love that erases boundaries, queer or straight. So I believe that, this boundary for queer people, it happens in terms of erasing sexual boundaries, right? When you have same-sex marriage between two women, for example, that the taboo or the boundaries between marriage and sex are erased when you have same-sex marriage. But more fundamentally, it's gender boundaries that are key to queer theory. I actually think that everything comes down to gender. I was talking to Dr. Wu about this beforehand, that, oftentimes LGBT people, we are very nervous about transgender people. The wonderful case about Ms. W and the transgender victory, in the Court of Final Appeal. I know in the United States, oftentimes people say, well, transgender doesn't really have to do with, usually LG people, lesbian, gay people, right? I think it's the other way around. I think lesbian gay people are a subset of transgender people. Actually, we're all transgender in the sense that we don't conform to gender norms. It's just, so it's not the other way around. Gender is at the heart of everything. But take the bathroom sign. I was very pleased to see that the bathrooms here are gender neutral, because bathrooms are a site of terror for transgender people, always having to choose the binary. Which bathroom do I walk in? And my own safety, Why do we need sort of, the divide? So I think, to have sort of a collapsed gender binary, sort of a queer figure, queerness is actually challenging the boundary that divides male and female, right? So let's just all have bathrooms that have this rainbow figure, right? I mean, it's just, single stalls, right? I mean, that's, so there's a great series of photos of drag queens. Have you seen this? That basically they ask drag queens to do makeup only on one side of their face. So you see how this person, he has made himself up as she on the left side, and the right side is not made up. And this Judith Butler, who is a queer theorist, has argued that gender is really actually performance. We think gender is something that's essentialist, but basically it's a performance that my voice, my hair, my dress, it's arguable, right? I mean, I carry myself as male, at least the performance, right? And so actually drag is, it challenges the assumptions about gender performance, right? So again, that's an example of erasing boundaries. Now, gender, I think, we think that gender normally is only one thing. I love this. Have any of you seen the genderbread person at all? Yes. It's like the gingerbread person, but it's actually the genderbread person. I use this tool for my queer theology class. My students are all, they're graduate students going into the ministry, so this is a very good tool. Gender actually has at least 4 components. Good. I see a lot of people taking pictures of the genderbread person. Yes. And so basically, one component is identity, right? Like our brain. Do you see that? Like what gender our brains say that we are. It may or may not match our biological sex, but there is identity. Then there's expression. So regardless of your identity, it's how you dress. Like even though my head, I'm cisgender, which means I identify as male, right? Non-transgender, but I could go in drag, and so my expression would be different. There's biological sex, which is based on the sex organs and the chromosomes. And then there's also orientation, right? Like your heart. Like who are you attracted to, same or different? Do you see that? How gender is actually more complicated. It's not just one thing or 2 buckets. There are actually many categories. So what I want to point out is that the dynamic that's going on with gender is that there are a series of binaries, right? That gender identity, man versus woman. You see, our society makes us choose one or the other. Gender expression, are you masculine or are you feminine? Biological sex, are you male, are you female? Sexual orientation, are you heterosexual, are you homosexual? Do you see that? How you're sort of forced not just to pick one side, but everything has to line up on one side or the other. So what's really queer, so this may look complicated, but what's really queer is the middle. You see that? Transgender is in the middle of male, man and woman. Androgynous is in the middle of masculine and feminine. Intersex is in between male and female. And bisexual is in between heterosexual and homosexual. Bisexuals are actually the most problematic. Churches freak out. I mean, even churches that are really good with lesbian and gay stuff and maybe transgender stuff, bisexuality, because it's in the middle, poses a real question, And bi people, it doesn't mean you have 2 people at once. It just means that, you're not, right? I mean, necessarily. I mean, there are poly people who are bi, but bisexuality, because it challenges the binaries. That's what queerness is. Queerness challenges the binary. So we have our genderbread person who lives in the middle of these categories, right? So do you get that? That basically queerness is challenging these gender binaries. So this is the second slide that I want you to pay attention to now, right? If you're dozing, if it's warm, if you're getting bored, pay attention. The reason why I argue that Christianity is queer, Christianity is radical love, is because the same thing is going on. It's the same dynamic. That in Christianity, it's talking about divinity and humanity, right, as 2 separate things. Normally, we think of divinity on one side, humanity on the other, right? We think of life on one side, death on the other, right? We think of eternity on one side, finitude on the other, and we think of grace on one side and sin on the other. You see how it's all sort of separate? What I want to argue is that the really queer thing about Christianity, this is the point now, you can leave, this is the, sort of thing to take away, is that the queer thing about Christianity is that it collapses those binaries. Jesus Christ is the ultimate, queering of Christianity, right? That in the incarnation, Christmas, right, when God becomes human, that is collapsing the binary between divinity and humanity, right? Like, when we celebrate Christmas, we talk about the Word made flesh. People who are not Christians, people have no idea. They sort of say, how can you believe this? And I agree, it makes no sense. But the reason why it makes no sense is because it collapses the binary between divinity and humanity. Easter, the resurrection. Easter queers the distinction between life and death. When you move from Good Friday to Easter Sunday, that is the queering of that binary. Similarly, Jesus queers eternity and finitude, even though Jesus had a life. Jesus was the Word from the beginning of time, and will come at the end of time, in the book of Revelation. So Jesus queers time. And Jesus also takes on our sin as well as, grace. So do you see how what I'm saying is what's going on in Christianity, the deep logic of Christianity, is actually the same exact logic of queerness. I don't see how you can argue. If you really understand what is going on with Christianity, it is the same logic that is going on with queerness. And so I think it's actually absurd that Christians are like, well, queerness is not compatible because they're looking at 6 verses, and out of 66 books. Come on, God created a brain, right? And so, you love God with your mind and your heart and your soul, right? So if we put on our minds, we have to understand what theology is about. There's 2,000 years of theological reflection. This is what theological reflection is about. So that's my point about queerness in Christianity. So Jesus is the ultimate eraser. I like this picture where Jesus is the pencil with the eraser. And Jesus actually, this is very orthodox. This is not something that's heretical. Jesus erases the boundary between death and life. Why else are we in this business other than the sort of the good news of the resurrection, moving from, Good Friday to Easter Sunday? And it is that erasure that is exactly the same logic as queerness and genderqueer. All right? So let me close, and I think we're good in terms of the time. Yep. Let me close with a calling of today's churches, what I believe today's churches are called to do. And this is a picture of a church with a rainbow flag, but I believe it's the calling of all churches, okay? And what I think one thing we need to do is reject what I call bibliolatry, or bibliolatry, which is basically the idolatry of the Bible, okay? So basically the Bible, I started on my theological journey because I took a intensive class in biblical Hebrew. I love the Bible. I know my Hebrew, I know my Greek, I know my Latin, I know my Aramaic, so I take the Bible very seriously. But it's one thing to take it seriously, it's another thing to turn it into a golden calf. And all too often, what we do, it's not using your mind. It's much easier just to flip open the book and just say, oh, well, it says this, But we are called to move beyond, the Ten Commandments says, reject idolatry. And I think what's going on with a lot of, Christian folks is that the Bible has become an idol. It is no longer a source of the good news. It's a source of stagnation and oppression of people. So one thing is that we need to reject bibliolatry. Second, we need to reject legalism. So this idea, right? It's ironic. The whole gospel is about moving from law to grace. Right? Even people who have problems with Paul would say that, a central part of Christianity is moving from law to grace. And yet, so much of what a lot of anti-gay Christians do is that they have this whole new version of legalism. It's just, I've spent, 15 years thinking about theology, but no, 6 verses says this, and therefore you're wrong, and therefore QED, it's the end of discussion. Wasn't that exactly what Jesus was critiquing the Pharisees for? Right? Jesus rejected Pharisaism, right? Because legalism that was exactly what Jesus was against. And I will tell you that as a queer theologian, I get hate mail all the time. I get hate mail. I will not open, the Mingbao article says, I won't open mail that no longer has a return address because I've had too many bad experiences with that. I get emails all the time from people just saying, I'm going to go to hell. What am I saying? But the one thing that all of these things share in common is a sense of legalism and bibliolatry. They're always like, well, the Bible says X, Y, and Z. You are not doing X, Y, and Z, therefore you're wrong and you're going to hell. It is that mindset, and they all share that. And I think there's something deeply wrong about that. If we're called to love other people, this is the antithesis of what I believe love is about. And I'm tired of that. People need to be called into account. And not only am I tired of that, it makes those of us that are people of faith and thinking Christians and compassionate Christians, it makes us look bad. Like when I go into the LGBT community, I'm seen as a traitor. It's hard for me to wear this collar because I'm not seen as a bearer of good news. I'm actually seen as an oppressor. And it's not because of anything I said. It's because of people who practice a modern-day legalism. They're the ones that are actually giving the rest of us a bad name. And I'm tired of it. Jesus was the one who erased boundaries. So not only did Jesus erase the boundary between life and death, Jesus also erased the boundaries between clean and unclean. Jesus was always touching people who are unclean, touching women who are bleeding, hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors, all the things that, sort of the Levitical codes, right? Everyone's, Leviticus 18 and 20. Well, yeah, it's like Jesus collapsed, the notions of clean and unclean. But it wasn't just Jesus, right? It was also Peter. Remember in Acts, Peter has this dream about the sheet that comes down with all these unclean animals, and God says you can eat that. Peter, right, the Pope, those of you that are Roman Catholics, right? And the first, the successor to Peter erased boundaries. Peter was queer, okay? And so are popes, but we won't go there. Okay, certain popes. All right. Paul erased boundaries too, right? The whole thing, Paul's letters, you can cite Romans, you can cite 1 Corinthians, you can cite 1 Timothy, but really, Paul's message was about erasing the line between Gentile and Jew, right? The whole thing, the letter to the Galatians, right? Slave or free, Jew or Greek, or male or female. Galatians was all about erasing boundaries. So Paul was queer too. So you got Jesus, you got Peter, you got Paul, they're all queer. All right, so how's that for queer theology? And I think, the irony is that anti-gay Christians are actually, instead of erasing boundaries, they're erecting boundaries between queer people on the one side and Christians on the other. They are fostering the same division that Paul is critiquing in Ephesians about breaking down that wall of oneness. They are actually creating boundaries that divide the two. So what Christians are called to do is not erect boundaries, but to erase them. We don't need blue states and red states, in the United States. We need purple states, right? Oops, I keep on, I'm getting a little too excited here. I'm preaching, right? Preaching the word, amen, right? Yeah. I wasn't even evangelical either. I think, see what Hong Kong does? Like, I was born Roman Catholic and teach in an Anglican place, but anyway, all right. So, but you see how this line, you're supposed to collapse the lines, right? That's what I believe churches are called to do, to erase the lines that divide us, not build up more lines. And, talk about eschatology. People say, well, you don't take eschatology or the end of time seriously. Well, I just taught a whole semester's class on eschatology at EDS. I teach another class on sin, grace, and atonement. And talk about the lion lying down with the lamb, right? Isn't that the ultimate sort of eschatology in terms of boundary erasure? What we think of the New Jerusalem and the New Zion is the ultimate in boundary erasure. So let me just close with like a sense of rainbow ethics. I think, as Christians, we're all called to rainbow ethics, not just LGBT people, but all Christian churches. And in some ways, what a rainbow ethics is about is challenging the status quo. For me, this idea of Jesus overturning the money changers' tables in the temples, right? We have Occupy Central, right? We need Occupy the Church. Okay, some people have been occupying the church, and we need to take back the church in the same way that Jesus took back the church, or Jesus took back from the religious authorities. And you know what? This is not an easy thing to do. Jesus was put to death by the religious and political authorities. He was crucified for standing up to the religious and political authorities. It is never an easy thing to do. It takes courage. But that is what rainbow ethics is about. It is a deep sense of challenging the status quo as a result of the truth. And, I would just sort of say, ironically, who is challenging the status quo most often are secular gay groups, LGBT groups, groups like the Big Love Alliance, right? The Idaho, right, International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, or just, sort of the I Am Me, I guess the anti-bullying thing, right, Pink Alliance. I mean, all these groups, you think of them, oh, they're not religious, right? They're just sort of secular groups. Ironically, in some ways, because they erase the boundaries and also challenge the status quo, in some ways they're more Christians than we Christians are. And I challenge you to sort of think about what the queer community can actually be a gift and how we can learn from them. It's not like they have to come learn from us. Maybe if we're a little bit more humble, we can learn from the queer community. And so I guess let me just end by saying there's a website called queerasianspirit.org that myself, Joseph Go, who is in Malaysia, we are co-editors of an e-zine. There are many resources if you're interested in LGBT Asian resources online. And not just Christian, but also interfaith. And we may hear some interfaith conversations. Not only is queer theology and queer theory very white, I think it is obsessed, in my view, with French deconstruction and sort of European continental philosophy. What if we used Eastern thought as a way of deconstructing sort of, philosophy? There hasn't been a lot of that done, and I think that would be really promising. And so for more information, my website is patrickcheng.net, and happy to talk to you more about that. So with that, the end, that's my presentation. And so, yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Hey,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. 好多謝鄭博士，剛才同我哋講咗，俾咗咁多好豐富嘅知識俾我哋啦。咁佢基本上就係頭先個講座都分咗4部分。咁首先佢係講咗佢自己故事啦。咁跟住佢又好簡單，即係其實佢好精簡咁話咗俾你聽乜嘢係酷兒，酷兒嘅理論同埋神學。咁第3部分呢，就係其實佢基督教強調嗰個包容嘅愛 （radical love）。咁佢話其實基督就係嚟消除除去界限嘅。咁跟住佢亦都提醒我哋教會其實我哋嘅責任，其實教會責任都係要除去界限。咁同埋最後就係講乜嘢係rainbow ethics 彩虹倫理，其實就係要去挑戰現狀咯。咁同埋最後我覺得好好，佢就話我哋可以其實用我哋自己嘅東方嘅思想思維係再去進一步去做呢個酷兒神學嘅。好，咁我哋咧首先咧，我哋而家就有呢個回應嘅一部分。咁我而家想介紹回應。唔使，哦，係，我想介紹我哋今日3位回應嘉賓。咁第一位咧就係我哋好高興 Bell 係來自基恩之家嘅崇拜部同工，係。咁第2位就係蒲錦昌牧師，係香港基督教協進會總幹事。咁跟住有胡露茜博士。咁我哋首先而家咧就請阿 Bell 咧就會係用一個酷兒基督徒嘅身份嚟幫我哋分享。咁跟住就會由蒲牧師咧就喺教會嘅角度啦。咁最後咧我哋就有阿 Rose 胡露茜博士就幫我哋喺神學嘅角度嗰度分享回應嘅。係，咁我哋請阿 Bell 先，係你可以用呢邊。
係，大家好，咁我叫阿 Bell 啦。咁我諗咧，其實之前就阿 Rose 揾我嚟嘅時候咧，其實我都有啲拗頭嘅，因為即係我自己本身都冇一神學嘅背景，但係原來佢就話我正正就係想你冇神學背景。咁啊係，咁喂，係得。咁我諗首先回應翻唔係要莊重啲，係 Patrick 博士。OK， 係啦。咁我諗就係佢其實我之前咧其實好老實講啦，之前就唔係好認識佢嘅背景啦，同埋佢即係佢曾經講過一啲嘅theology， 但係即係依幾日同埋我自己都有去再即係深究佢睇嘅嘢嘅時候咧，咁我就發現其實佢係一個即係就係一個咁簡單係好將成個嘅神學拉翻去最根源嗰部分，就係愛嗰部分。我諗其實在我嚟講咧，因為我有一個好深嘅印象，就係其實我一路以嚟都曾經我係一個基督徒，但係我係一個唔中意讀聖經嘅基督徒。因為咧，當其時喺自己嘅教會入邊咧，實在太多經驗，就係好多時候都係用一啲嘅 scripture 咧去話俾你聽，你應該係咁，你應該係咁，愛係咁啊！我仲記得就係話禮拜六如果要喺教會度有一個 worship 而係一個 as 一個 music worship 嘅話咧，你就唔啱啦。咁我就即係嗰陣時，因為我 raise 咁樣樣嘢，咁跟住變咗當其時就喺個教會係好唔愉快。咁亦都係因為一個咁嘅過程入邊咧，其實我對於聖經嗰個嘅印象咧，初睇係好差嘅。咁啊後尾咧就當然啦，而家就 another case 啦。咁後尾咧就去到即係近呢一幾年嘅時間開始咧，咁我接觸多咗即係我身邊嘅好多嘅同志朋友啦。咁開始知道有基恩之家啦，咁所以我先至去接觸，即係更加了解到原來即係喺聖經入邊我所睇到嘅聖經入邊嘅嘢咧，就係原來係二手嘅。因為好多時候喺過往嘅經驗入邊咧，就係喺自己嘅以前教會入邊咧，就話俾你聽，你應該係咁，你應該係咁。但係我自己係冇真真正正走去睇呢個聖經入邊所講嘅一啲説話。咁所以我諗而家其實在我嚟講最大嘅一個嘅改變咧，就係你要容讓去自己，當你要有多啲唔同嘅要 explore 多啲嘅嘢咯，而唔係話你去攞人哋話俾你聽啲乜嘢，你就認為係啱嘅嘢。即係呢個係一個好重要嘅嘢咯。因為我諗而家喺香港好多時候都係實在太快餐啦，即係好多嘢就你喺上網攞完之後係啱㗎啦，應該有幾百個人 like 嘅話咧就啱㗎啦，應該係咁樣。咁但係點樣為之係幾百個人 like 嘅嘢就係啱嘅咧？呢啲就係一個 majority 同埋 minorities 嘅嘢嚟㗎咯。咁我覺得呢樣嘢對我嚟講係一個好大嘅一個 impact 咯。喺教會入邊，尤其是我喺基恩入邊，我覺得係一個好大嘅一個 challenge 嚟嘅。咁另外就係去到鄭書祥博士所講嘅嘢咧，最深印象咧就係佢講嘅 eraser。因為在我嚟講咧，其實以前我一路都覺得咧上帝同埋喺我嘅生命入邊咧係一個好 separate 嘅嘢嚟嘅，即係佢喺上面，我喺下邊。咁但係鄭書祥博士所講嘅嘢有一樣嘢令到我好深刻印象咧，就係佢講嘅嗰種 eraser 咧，其實就係佢走入喺我哋嘅生命入邊，喺我哋關係入邊，無論係愛侶之間、朋友、老師、學生作任何嘅 relationship 入邊，其實都係一個佢點樣係 dissolve 喺你嘅生命入邊 ，dissolve 咗喺你哋嘅一個 relationship 入邊。而唔係話緊俾你聽，嗱你唔應該係咁嘅，上帝話緊俾你聽，你應該係咁，即係話鄭書祥博士所講嘅就係話即係咪咁教條式咧？我哋所睇嘅嘢係咪就係一個咁即係一個律法主義嘅嘢嚟嘅咧？咁所以即係我覺得呢樣嘢係一個好好嘅提醒嚟。咁所以就正呢樣嘢咧，亦都係俾我 reflect 翻咧。咁我同我身邊嗰個伴侶咧，就係好多時候咧。就 set 咗好之前我哋一齊開始嘅時候咧，其實我哋都 set 咗好多個 boundaries 啊。即係譬如佢同我講，佢話咧，其實你係打破晒所有嘅規條嘅。例如我唔可以，即係佢話你係矮過我啦，跟住你係一個女仔啦，跟住你所有總之係個脾氣又唔多好啊，諸如此類嘅嘢啦。咁總之就係即係喺呢個過程入邊咧，其實我都覺得係一個。令到我喺度諗就係正正就係喺呢段關係入邊，我好感受到，因為我同我 partner 其實即係已經係今年係第7年啦。咁其實喺呢段關係入邊，我係好感受到就係原來神唔係喺你嘅高高在上，喺你嘅後邊、前面、左邊、右邊，而係喺我哋兩個之間嘅一個好大嘅一個推動。咁好多時候我哋之間有好多嘅問題啊，甚至乎去到其實 actually 都係佢帶 即係叫我翻嚟基恩啦，係佢叫我要睇多啲聖經啦，聖經唔係淨係得個6章嘢啦，唔好淨係掛住嗰6章嘢啦咁樣，嗰6個章節啦咁樣。咁亦都係因為呢個咁樣嘅推動嚟一個咁嘅 interaction， 亦都即係正正就係回應咗就係鄭書祥博士所講嘅，即係你點樣去透過神所俾你最根源嗰種愛嚟到去 erase 所有唔應該有嘅 boundaries 喺入邊。咁我覺得呢個係一個好好提醒嚟嘅咯。咁啊，最後就係我覺得係有一樣嘢就係好多時候最後尾鄭書祥博士都話咧係一個即係對於現今嗰個教會嘅一個 calling。咁我覺得有一樣嘢喺香港嚟講，我以我自己一個體驗就係話實在太多形形色色嘅嘢啦 ，mega church。實在太多認為應該係應該係要咁樣行嘅，咁所有人就應該要咁樣行啦。即係我哋要再睇翻就係話係咪我哋係跟大眾嘅咧，定還是係真真正正落翻落去？其實喺聖經入邊嗰個即係嗰種大愛嗰種最根源嗰種原點喺入邊咧，其實就係正正用愛嚟到去包容所有嘅愛喺入邊咯。咁所以我諗將來希望喺未來日子裏邊咧，我哋嘅 picture 唔係淨係響今日呢一個框框嘅講嘅所謂嘅係喺呢個神學入邊，而係希望係 explore 多啲更多唔同嘅神學，而係你睇到更豐富嘅 picture。因為我相信神所俾嘅愛係無限嘅咯。咁係咁多，唔該晒。
各位朋友、各位弟兄姊妹，大家好嚇。咁咧就我都學阿 Patrick 啦，即係企喺中間講啦，好嘛嚇。咁牧師都唔係一定要用講台嘅咁嚇。我咧就即係做一啲準備咧，因為咧就我哋會收到阿 Patrick 嘅 outline 啦，咁然後咧就要作啲準備啦咁啊。咁但係我睇完之後都唔知道，即係阿 Patrick 將會講啲乜嘢，咁所以我自己又為自己定咗個題目，然後揀咗段聖經咁嚇。咁我定個題目唔知點解就同阿 Rose 一本書好似啊，就係叫做超越對與錯嘅思考模式，就同耶穌一齊做神學咁嚇。宗教信仰究竟有咩意義咧？咁嚇，其實宗教信仰咧，往往咧係詮釋一個過去嚇，同埋咧展望一個將來，就為我哋現在嘅生活咧作一個嘅即係方向指標咁嚇。有啲人佢咧就係。即係雖然係孤兒啦，但係當佢再詮釋佢嘅生命係同上帝有關係嘅時候，咁佢就有一個生命嘅力量，同埋相信咧人間都仍然係有愛嘅，值得去追求嘅咁嚇，有新嘅意義咁嚇。有人咧係因為對於未來有盼望，就算喺現在極大痛苦裏面咧，佢都覺得忍受得住咁嚇。咁所以其實對於過去嘅一個嘅塑造嚇詮釋，同埋對於未來一個嘅想望咧，其實會影響咗我哋現在點樣去生活咁嚇。咁咧就我想同大家讀一段嘅聖經啦，就係響呢個約翰福音第9章讀幾節咁多啦咁嚇。就係講耶穌遇到一個生來瞎眼嘅人嘅嚇。喺耶穌在路上看見一個生來就失明的人，他對他的門徒問他：老師，這個人生來就失明，是誰的罪造成的？是他自己的罪，或是他父母的罪呢？耶穌回答：他失明跟他自己或他父母的罪都沒有關係，而是要在他身上彰顯上帝的作為嚇。大家可能都好熟悉呢段聖經，會睇過咁嚇。咁咧就當時候嘅人咧就諗只有兩個可能性嘅啫，即係點解現在呢個朋友咁嘅樣嚇，佢生來瞎眼，一個可能就係佢爸爸有問題啦咁，即係呢個叫做先天論嚇。第二個問題就係佢自己有問題咯，咁呢個叫後天論咁嚇。咁即係只有呢兩種，你就揀其中一種啦咁。佢詮釋佢嘅過去同埋佢現在遇到嘅咁嘅情況盲眼個原因係乜嘢咁嚇？咁咧就應該就係呢兩個答案其中一個咁嚇。咁咪叫做對與錯之間咁。我哋好多時候都講究竟同志係啱唔啱嘅咧咁嚇？如果係先天嘅唔關佢事咯咁嚇。咁如果你後天嘅咧，所謂後天嘅益係佢自己造成嘅啦嚇。一係個社會造成，咁就係個社會嘅錯啦。咁總之都係咧，佢有問題啦嚇。即係無論社會嘅罪或者佢自己個人嘅罪咁嚇。咁耶穌點答呢一個嘅情況咧？咁耶穌就話：既唔係佢嘅罪，亦都唔係佢父母嘅罪， 而係喺佢身上面要顯出上帝嘅作為咁。咁係咩意思咧？咁咧就耶穌首先就話兩樣都唔係啊，即係打破一個咧係一般人有嘅思想，或者當時嘅一種嘅神學嘅論述嚇。咁又跟住咧，耶穌就話要顯出上帝嘅作為，咁就更加難解啦。咁即係話係咪即係話咧，上帝特登整埋佢，然後到今日話上帝幾犀利，可以令到佢打開翻眼咁？我諗咧就聖經想講嘅唔係咁嘅意思啊，而係想講咧就係話其他人睇佢嘅過去個造成咧就係亦係佢父母有問題，亦係佢有問題啊。耶穌係睇到佢嘅未來，係想塑造佢嘅將來，就話你睇下佢有幾大嘅可能性咁嚇。咁當然啦，後嚟耶穌咧就醫好咗呢個人啊，然後咧佢產生嘅生命力係連嗰啲法利賽人都唔相信嘅。但係又冇得抵賴嘅，即係冇辦法否認呢個人的確唔同咗咁嚇。的確咧，佢從來冇想過咧，佢就係即係可以係變到咁嘅咁。咁而你點樣再解釋翻轉頭咧？咁即係話，梗係佢父母有問題啦，梗係佢有問題啦。呢兩個答案似乎解釋唔到佢現在嘅情況啊。如果係咁，點解佢咁有生命力咧？咁啊，即係解釋唔到咁啊。咁就舊有嘅嗰個嘅神學咧就打破咗啦咁啊。嗱，如果咧你睇翻耶穌呢度咧，你會睇到耶穌對呢一個人嘅一種 radical love 係咪？即係佢係見到呢個人，佢係睇到嘅可能性，同時候亦都係關切呢個人嘅需要咁。如果你咧係睇福音書裡面講耶穌咧，耶穌係咁嘅，佢每一次接觸到人都係表達出呢種嘅愛，而係冇一個格式嘅，從來都冇一個格式嘅。有時候就話你嘅病好翻就係即係你可以行走啦嚇。有時候咧就話你嘅信救咗你啦。有時話你嘅罪得赦免啦，即係從來都冇一種固定嘅格式，就因為每一個人都係獨特嘅咁啊。正如同志啦，或者你係transgender 嘅啦嚇，或者bisexual咩都好，其實你都係獨特嘅嚇。即係耶穌係 address 你嘅獨特性，就唔係整一套神學出嚟，然後將你擺落去，即係放喺某一個嘅位置咁嚇。我諗呢個咧係喺我讀新約嘅時候發現到嘅耶穌係咁樣樣嚇。如果你讀新約，你發覺咧耶穌佢係喺一個咁嘅過程裡面，佢係即係做緊神學嚇。咁當然啦，其實我哋都係透過我哋自己嘅生命生活嚟到做緊我哋嘅神學。所以依家普遍咧就唔叫做係你讀神學啦咁啊。依家一般嚟講叫話我做神學咁啊。意思即係話咧，其實我哋每一個人都用緊我哋嘅生命去做緊我哋嘅神學，寫緊我哋嘅神學嚇。咁而咧，亦都同時候你創造緊教會嘅歷史啦咁。即係當我哋話所有信徒相聚埋一齊嘅時候，其實就係一個教會咁啊。咁我哋亦都係創造緊教會嘅歷史咁啊。耶穌用過一個講法，呢個比喻，佢就話即係新酒唔能夠裝在舊皮袋裡面嚇。如果咁嘅話咧，個袋就會破㗎啦咁。新酒係需要裝響新嘅皮袋裡面咁嚇。我哋嘅生命力如果有影響嘅時候咧，係會打破呢個舊皮袋嘅咁嚇。咁然後到時候咧就要出現一個新皮袋嚟，然後先能夠載呢個嘅新酒咁啊。耶穌嘅福音咧就係一種咁有力量嘅福音啦咁啊。咁當我哋讀新約聖經嘅時候，我哋唔係接受一套嘅神學，即係而係咧，你會睇到耶穌透過講故事，透過佢嘅比喻，通常呢啲咧都係開放性嘅，即係話唔係話一個答案一條嘅 proposition 咁啊，一個咧嘅一個教條咁，而往往咧你會睇到咧人嘅可能性啊，你會睇到咧嗰個嘅人嘅生命力啊，福音嘅大能咁。咁呢啲都係咧透過耶穌喺每一個獨特嘅 case 裏面嘅情況裏面去呈現出嚟嘅咁嚇。咁我諗咧就你睇翻耶穌嘅時候咧，就係佢個人本身就係即係佢呢套信念嘅呈現咁嚇，而唔係咧一啲嘅教條咁啊。咁我諗咧呢個亦都係福音裏面咧係即係嗰個力量嘅所在啦咁嚇。咁所以我就即係作出以下嘅。你可以話呼籲啦咁嚇。咁如果你係 即係同志嘅或者咧係即係transgender 嘅或者其他嘅都好咁嚇。我哋每一個人嘅身份都係獨特嘅咁嚇。上帝都俾我哋未來有一個可能性嚇。如果我哋活出呢種耶穌叫做豐盛嘅生命啦嚇，即係我來了是要叫人得生命並且得的更豐盛。只要你能夠活出一種豐盛嘅生命，呢一種嘅生命力就會影響到其他人啦咁嚇。而呢種生命咧，往往亦都係會透過我哋對於自己生命嘅了解即係過去啦同埋未來啦咁嚇。對於信仰嘅詮釋同埋我哋自己靈性生命嘅栽培而產生出嚟嘅咁嚇。咁所以一定係同我哋嘅靈性生命同我哋嘅信仰其實係有關係嘅，又唔係冇關係嘅咁啊，而唔係話單單任何一個人咁你有一個生活，個生活咧本身其實都係要栽培嘅咁啊，咁呢種生命力咧先會散發得咧係更加有力量咁嚇。呢個第一個啦咁我希望咧大家都係懷住愛去生活，而唔需要懷住仇恨去生活咁嚇。即係可能我哋喺教會生活裏面都受過好多嘅挫折嚇，好多嘅折磨咁啊。我唔覺得咧係用仇恨嚟到去生活咧能夠解決咗呢啲嘅問題嚇。咁所以我哋都應該係去用愛嚟到去生活咁啊。咁第二咧我就呼籲教會嚇，即係教會應該咧係接納任何人咁嚇，無論佢係同志啊或者 transgender 嘅等等都好咁嚇。咁我哋咧都應該接納佢哋，係視佢哋為我哋嘅弟兄姊妹嚇，我哋嘅兒女嚇。因為上帝佢視每一個人都係佢嘅兒女，都係佢珍貴嘅創造嚇。然後耶穌基督話：任何奉行佢旨意嘅，其實都係佢嘅兄弟姊妹咁啊。如果我哋喺我哋嘅生活裏面能夠體會上帝嘅旨意，而生活喺裏面咁你就係耶穌基督嘅兄弟姊妹啦咁嚇。咁呢個就唔需要咧係其他人去證實嘅。你個內心咧會話俾你聽，你係耶穌基督嘅兄弟姊妹咁嚇。咁所以我咧就呼籲教會係要接納同志嚇，成為咧我哋中間嘅一份子。其實原本大家都喺我哋嘅中間咁啊，唔應該咧係即係踢佢哋出去，然後咧應該咧係擁抱佢哋，因為其實我哋每一位咧都係上帝嘅兒女咁嚇。願上帝咧係祝福大家。
我就好乖嘅，準備咗中文同埋英文嘅廣告，因為好攰啊，我驚我甩碌啊。首先係再一次啦，非常之感激啊鄭書祥博士牧師，從呢係好遠啦波士頓而嚟到，咁擔任我哋今年激揚大會嘅嘉賓講員啦。更加榮幸你留低呢係同我哋今晚呢個聖神學社舉行呢一場酷兒神學嘅公開講座。咁我咧就會嘗試從以下兩方面去回應嘅。第一方面咧就係介紹一下香港酷兒運動嘅在地實踐。咁呢一方面咧就鄭博士咧未必可以同我哋講到嚇，需要我哋自己喺呢一個處境之下去回顧翻我哋嘅歷史。咁第二方面咧，我就會從佢所提出嘅呢個酷兒神學所揭示嘅基督徹底嘅愛，究竟對我同埋對大家可以有咩啟發咧？咁。香港嘅酷兒神學咧，並唔係抽空咁樣移植西方嘅酷兒理論嘅，而係經過我哋本土嘅在地實踐嘅經驗，而慢慢咧係孕育出嚟嘅。香港酷兒運動嘅發展咧，同以下我一陣間會提嘅嗰3個組織嘅成立咧，係有好大嘅關係。第一個組織咧就係姊妹同志。咁喺94年底嘅時候咧，當時我喺婦女基督徒協會工作，咁當時我哋差遣咗金佩偉同埋當時喺女協實習嘅一個神學生叫龍雁玲咧，就去咗德國參加一個國際性嘅女同志嘅大會。咁呢一次會議咧就感動咗佢哋兩個。翻嚟之後咧，金佩偉咧就同佢嘅一啲好朋友咧喺95年嘅1月咧就成立咗第一個植根於香港以 Queer Sister呢個名號咧嚟到係成立呢個組織，咁中文咧就係叫做姊妹同志。咁佢哋咧就係除咗要挑戰父權意識、顛覆呢個異性戀中心主義，仲係試圖咧係去擴闊當時咧坊間對於同志嘅一啲狹隘嘅定義啦，提出情慾本身咧係流動性嘅。同志咧就唔應該只係局限於同性戀或者雙性戀，亦都包括虐戀啊、易服啊、變性及冇性愛等在內嘅性傾向。 姊妹同志認為咧，我哋要共同奮鬥保障嘅唔係一個身份，而係一個人。咁金佩偉同麥海珊咧喺2000年嘅時候咧就出版咗《雙性情慾》呢一本書。咁聽聞呢本書係香港甚至台灣同埋大陸咧第一本係談論雙性情慾嘅書嚟嘅。我睇翻轉頭，同姊妹同志嘅出現，其實確實係為當時係仍然以呢個男同性戀主導嘅同運界，同埋咧只係強調男女平權嘅婦運界帶嚟唔少衝擊嘅。姊妹同志嘅運動策略同埋佢哋對同志身份嘅拆解，其實真係清楚反映咗酷兒理論嘅一啲觀點。第二個組織係紫藤。隨著紫藤咧喺1996年11月成立之後咧，香港嘅妓權運動咧就正式被提升到咧係公眾嘅議程啦。紫藤嘅創辦人嚴月蓮，佢批評嗰啲保守嘅道德捍衛者，一方面咧係支持政府去嚴打啲性工業啦，一方面咧又宣稱佢哋係關愛性工作者，其實係相當偽善嘅。紫藤認為咧，真正剝削佢哋嘅係歧視同埋唔公平嘅法律，令到啲姐姐仔咧係成為社會上邊最邊緣嘅一群。喺任何社會當中，所有女人都應該有權選擇自己嘅職業。性工作係工作，性工作者亦都係勞工嘅一份子。從酷兒運動嘅角度咧，將性工作除罪化以及去污名化，除咗係挑戰呢一種不公義嘅性層級主義，亦都重新去肯定所有女性，包括性工作者嘅性自主權。第三個組織就係跨性別資源中心。Joanne 今晚唔喺度啊。嗱，Joanne 梁詠欣係香港少數願意出櫃嘅變性人之一。佢原生嘅性別係男，經歷咗40幾年嘅身份掙扎，終於喺香港咧就完成咗性別嘅轉換手術啦。正式喺身份證上邊咧被認可為女性。然而咧，佢仍然堅持自己嘅跨性別身份，同埋咧係相信自己係喜愛女性嘅。為咗讓社會係加深認識跨性別議題及跨性別人士嘅處境同埋需要咧，Joanne 同幾位跨性別人士同埋學者咧喺2008年7月咧就一同創立咗跨性別嘅資源中心啦。Joanne 同其他跨性別人士能夠咁勇敢咁站出嚟，挑戰傳統社會既有嘅一啲性別刻板文化同埋性別體制。佢哋所展現嗰種多元而又充滿個別差異同埋變化可能性嘅身體形態同埋生命故事，確實為本土嘅酷兒運動注入咗更多新嘅靈感同埋力量嘅。以下我會嘗試從酷兒神學所揭示嘅基督徹底嘅愛嚟到作一啲嘅反省。嗱，相信我哋大家都同意，今日絕大多數嘅香港教會對於我以上所列舉嗰啲酷兒一族必定係會感到好陌生、好恐懼，甚至厭惡同埋鄙視嘅。只係因為佢哋相信唯有異性戀終身婚姻制度之內，並且能夠成就生育嘅性，先至係上主所祝福同埋容許嘅性行為同埋性關係，亦都就係傳統宗教一直奉為絕對真理嘅性倫理規範。呢啲規範嘅基礎係建基於非男即女啦、非同即異嘅二元性別對立嘅思維邏輯。但係我要問，喺呢啲規範以外嘅陌生人他者，係咪就真係不被上主祝福同埋接納嘅呢？究竟呢啲關乎性嘅道德標準係按照邊啲人嘅經驗同埋判斷嚟到定義嘅呢？如果教會只能夠喺封閉嘅系統裏邊訴諸所謂聖經嘅絕對權威，排除同其他學科知識嘅進行對話，並且漠視人喺真實處境當中所遇到嘅掙扎同埋需要，我哋嘅神學仲可唔可以為不同時代嘅人提供適切嘅福音訊息呢？我好慶幸喺我哋華人神學世界當中，仍然有好似鄭書祥牧師、歐陽文峰牧師、卜沙倫牧師等。佢哋能夠以自己赤裸嘅肉身經驗嚟到去述說酷兒基督嘅故事。鄭博士今晚分享當中最打動我嘅就係佢能夠非常之精要咁樣，以基督最徹底嘅愛嚟到去展示酷兒神學最核心嘅福音精神。酷兒神學可能最大嘅威脅就係佢係企圖去攪擾同埋顛覆，正係主流社會同教會所持守嘅呢一種性別二元區分嘅思維邏輯。 去打破性同埋性別嘅層級主義，使情慾或者性唔再有高下、好壞之分，或者正常同變態之分。酷兒神學引領我哋翻去基督教最核心嘅信仰，就係基督最徹底嘅愛 （radical love）， 超越一切人為嘅分隔，包括性別、性向、種族、階級、年齡、心智以及體能等嘅差異。呢個愛其實係要化解同埋消除一切人為嘅歧視、界線同埋隔閡，重新去肯定每一個人都可以按照自己好獨特嘅性別身份同埋情慾渴求嚟到表達同埋追求一個滿全嘅人生。教會作為基督嘅身體，理應係要團結社會上邊所有嘅人，包括啲不一樣嘅性別身份同埋情慾經驗嘅人，去建立一個真係彼此尊重同埋平等公義嘅群體。教會所施行嘅洗禮同埋聖餐，係象徵住人同生命嘅創造者，人與他人以及人與自己嘅復和，從而達至呢一個合一嘅團契。然而呢度所指嘅合一，並唔係將一切變成齊一、統一或者劃一，或者係所謂聯合性嘅組織。合一嘅前提係要明白萬事萬物本來就係多元同埋不一樣，但係我哋彼此仍然可以互相聯繫。我非常之喜歡南非道徒主教所講嘅一句説話，佢話 ：We are made for togetherness, not for sameness。我哋被創造唔係要我哋要變成一式一樣嘅人，而係要學習點樣去相處。近幾年咧，我就留意到越嚟越多同志嘅朋友咧係選擇歸依佛教。呢個現象咧就引發我對佛教嘅興趣啦，特別係入世佛教 Engaged Buddhism 嘅倡議者一行禪師嘅佛理，發覺佢所演繹嘅嗰個無分別心嚇 non-discrimination， 同埋相即相入 interbeing 嘅正念修習，同我哋酷兒神學所提出嘅嗰種跨越差異同埋擁抱整全生命嘅福音精神有好多相似嘅地方，係值得我哋基督徒反省同埋學習嘅。以下咧，我就引用一行禪師有一次喺法國嘅梅村禪修營裏邊，佢回應一位同志信徒提問嘅時候，佢就提出咗話上帝也是女同志呢個見解。咁呢度我出嚟咧係有一個小段同大家分享。一行禪師話：佢話身為一位被歧視同埋壓迫嘅受害者，可以點樣將自己嘅苦難從苦難中去解放出嚟呢？佢話基督教認為上帝創造萬物，包括人，而造物者同埋被造物之間係有區別嘅。眾生係由上帝所創造嘅。一行禪師話：當我睇見一朵花嘅時候，我知道、我看見、我想到呢朵花係上帝創造嘅。佢話由於我係一個佛教嘅修行者，佢覺知道造物者同埋被造物之間係有某種嘅聯繫嘅，否則創造就冇可能啦。因此，菊花可以話上帝係花，而我同意，因為上帝先要有花嘅元素，花先至能夠成為現實，所以花有權話上帝係花。白人有權話上帝係白人，同樣黑人亦都有權話上帝係黑人。事實上，假如你去到非洲，你會睇到聖母瑪利亞嘅雕像係黑色嘅。如果你唔將聖母瑪利亞嘅雕像染成黑咧，佢唔能夠引起共鳴。因為對黑人而言，黑人係美好嘅，所以黑人有權話上帝係黑人。而且一行禪師話佢亦都確信上帝係黑人。不過佢話上帝唔單止係黑人，上帝亦都係白人，上帝亦都係一朵花。所以佢話當你係一位女同志，思察你同上帝關係嘅時候咧，假如你嘅修習夠深入嘅話咧，你會發現上帝亦都係女同志。否則你點會喺世上出現呢？上帝係女同志，那就係佢嘅見解。同樣亦都係講出上帝亦都可以係男同志。上帝不止於此，上帝係女同志，亦都係男同志，係黑人、係白人、係菊花。只因為你唔了解呢個道理，你先至會歧視嘅啫。咁我最後就會咁樣總結：唯有愛可以讓我哋去認出佛陀中嘅基督。基督中嘅佛陀，亦都唯有愛可以讓我哋認出酷兒身上嘅基督，以及基督身上嘅酷兒。阿鄭書祥博士牧師，感謝你精彩嘅演講，俾我哋對酷兒神學有更深入嘅認識。你嘅臨在更加係一份豐富嘅禮物， 讓我哋呢個酷兒一族嚇同埋支持酷兒嘅朋友都能夠咧親眼見到彩虹嘅再現嘅曙光。多謝你。
好多謝我哋3位嘅回應嘉賓。好啦，咁我諗咧大家等咗成晚咧，可能都有好多問題要發問，或者你亦都可以回應啊、分享啦。咁我哋而家邀請翻鄭博士上嚟先。Patrick, please, this is the time for discussion or response from the floor. Yes. Jason, will you do simultaneous translation or someone? So that, yes, you probably would need a mic. 係。咁嗱，請大家先講咗你嘅介紹咗你自己先啦，你嘅名，然後跟住你就可以係。係咪嗰位男士舉咗手？係
Rose, could I just say a few words also just to respond to the respondents?
Okay. We kind of think that maybe after this, then you respond. Oh, would you like to respond now, maybe?
Just real quick.
Sure.
But
鄭博士想回應啊。
I'll be real quick. Okay. I mean, just
take your time.
I just wanted to thank the 3 respondents for the time and seriousness that you took in responding to my lecture. Are you? Oh, okay. She's just in here. Okay. And I just wanted to thank Ms. Bell Tsia for the power of your experience. I think when you talked about the experience with your partner, I think a lot of us who are LGBT, we need to take that experience just as seriously as the Bible, and so and to trust ourselves as having experience of God. And so, Reverend General Secretary, thank you for reminding us that the church should be a place where we encounter Jesus, not just a place of rules, but that where we can fall in love and actually have a relationship with Jesus, and that queer theology takes Jesus seriously. And finally, Dr. Wu, just again, thank you for that reminder on interfaith reflection. I think that is the cutting edge, and I think that is something that queer Asian theologies can really contribute and need to go. So, was that good enough? Okay.
No, you can. Maybe later on, if we have time, and then you respond again. Okay. 好，咁係咪有位男士係你舉咗手係？
喂，唔好意思，我英文唔好啊。我英文唔好，唔好意思。我英文唔好，我只可以
唔緊要，你用中文講得講到有翻譯。
鄭生，我想問下，香港其實我理解絕大部分教會都係反對同志嗰個嘅態度。佢哋嘅理由其實好簡單，聖經對反對同志嘅條文係非常之清晰，無可爭辯。雖然呢條文佔聖經嘅極少部分，但係呢條文係佢哋理解聖經同性戀係罪，同性戀應該悔改。如果唔係咧，教會唔應該容納佢哋。咁我哋點樣去演繹呢條文？我哋點樣去再理解呢條文？係咪聖經嗰個問題，定係香港教會嘅問題咧 ？Thank you.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is you're saying the Bible has the verses that condemn homosexuality, and how can we sort of reinterpret that, or how do we deal with those verses that talk about that, especially churches that sort of say that homosexuality is a sin, right? And I think I've been trying to say in my lecture that that God created us with minds, and so we're to love God with not just our hearts and our souls, but with our minds. And that, unlike a monkey that just plays a grinder and just spits out the same notes over and over again, we human beings have to look at the whole interpretation of Scripture. And so I would actually say that, if you want to talk about those verses, I think they all address, I take them seriously. I don't think they speak about same-sex love today. None of them do. If you want to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and Genesis 19, it's about rape. Rape is wrong. Gay rape, straight rape, genderqueer rape is wrong. Okay? I mean, you want to talk about Romans? That's about idolatry and objectifying people. Romans 1 talks about idolatry. in a relationship, you don't treat the other person as an idol. So I don't think these biblical writers were talking about the loving relationships we have today. And so all the people who cite these biblical verses, 9.9 out of 10 of them haven't even read the Greek or the Hebrew. They don't even know which language the original scripture was written in. I mean, I don't mean to be, but I'm just saying it's like, you are so certain, but I actually think that it's important for us to realize that interpretation requires hard work. So I take it seriously. And in fact, I think we should think about sin, for example, as shame. There are lots of sins. A sin for gay people is not lifting yourself high up enough. A lot of feminists have taught us that a lot of sins for women is that, God is calling us to do great things, and, we stay down where we are because we think we're not smart enough or good enough or beautiful enough or accomplished enough. And that's just wrong. That's the real sin, not pride. So, thank you.
係麗君。
多謝鄭教授嘅分享嚇，我有兩個問題嘅。第一咧就係queer as a umbrella， 咁呢個 umbrella 下低咧又有個 queer 喎，咁究竟下低嗰個 queer 係乜嘢嚟嘅咧嚇？第二咧就係點解 sex worker 唔喺呢個 umbrella 下低嘅咧？因為 sex worker 本身其實佢哋做緊好多跨界，亦都做緊好多 erase boundary 嘅嘢㗎。如果用頭先嗰個嘅嗰啲嘅 point 擺入去咧，佢哋好多係就係咁樣咯。佢哋係喺所謂好女人與壞女人中間去遊走，佢哋喺行業與唔係學呢個行業中間去遊走。喺佢哋嘅工作嘅裏邊，亦都係出眾咗好多人去erase 咗嗰個嘅 boundary 嘅嚇。好多人上嚟，佢哋係冇辦法喺現實嘅生活裏邊去做佢哋想做嘅性別角色。佢想扮女人，佢嚟到佢會扮女人。佢想做唔同嘅角色，佢嚟嘅 client 佢哋可以做唔同嘅角色，係因為 sex worker 能夠提供一個空間去促進呢一種咁樣嘅 erase boundary。咁我就即係唔明白點解喺呢個 queer 裏邊冇 sex worker 喺度咧？好嚇。
Thank you very much. So I'm hearing the question is, one is, in terms of the umbrella with queer, there's queer again, right? So what does that mean? And in particular, the particular social location of sex workers, right? And how sex workers often also erase boundaries, and many of the things that were talked about LGBT people apply to that community also, right? Yes. So thank you. My view is this. One, in terms of the umbrella and the term queer again, I think the reason why queer appears again is that I have many friends who are allies who are very proud to identify themselves as queer, right? That they don't, they may be married, in terms of straight relationship, but nonetheless, their thinking is very boundary crossing. And so as allies, or even in how they live their lives, some people who do not have children, for example, heterosexual couples who don't have children can be seen as queer also. So that's a very special category that's very fluid. And I think it's actually a beautiful category that, I feel very happy when I have allies who identify as queer. And then thank you for the particular context of sex workers. I think it's very important. I think so much of the gift that LGBT people and queer people have is to break silences and shame. So much, there's so much going on out there that we aren't able to talk about it. And I think the witness that your work, as well as sex workers, in terms of breaking the silence and shame about sex work and the community, the issues, economic, political, religious, spiritual, is really important. And so thank you for making that point. And I think that's an important issue that there's a recent book that's been published on male sex work and queer theory. So I look forward to further reflections on that. Thank you.
仲有邊位？你哋除咗發問之後，可以有回應或者分享都得嘅。係呢位。
係想回應下嘅，其實我 我其實自己就翻緊日頭咧每個星期日都翻緊香港基督教會啦咁樣。咁其實其實我覺得即係出邊好多教會咧，就算我哋話我哋就算當同性戀係罪都好啦。其實咧啱啱我星期日喺個主日崇拜講道，其實個牧者都即係主動走出嚟講。其實如果用翻同一段經文，佢話親男色嘅、偷窺嘅、醉酒嘅、咒罵人嘅，都不能承受神嘅國嘅話，咁個牧者真係問我哋：咁點解同性戀嘅你哋要講佢出去，但係咧偷嘢啊、醉酒啊嗰啲你唔會講佢出去咧？咁樣同一段經文，如果大家睇到嗰段經文，同一段經文，點解你淨係睇嗰個位就睇唔到其他咧？咁樣咁我覺得即係我自己係好覺得好被鼓勵。其實係即係我哋做緊嘢，其實係有人係睇清咗段經文講啲乜嘢咯。縱然我唔覺得親男色的一定係解緊同性戀啦咁樣，但係我覺得呢個世界上都係有啲人喺度即係做緊啲啱嘅嘢啦，同埋係講緊即係真係睇緊聖經嘅説話咯咁樣。
So thank you for your comment. And I'm hearing that you're asking about, for example, 1 Corinthians 6:9 or 1 Timothy 1:10. Right? I mean, those verses in the Pauline letters about homosexuals not inheriting the kingdom of God, right? Yeah, I think, again, I think this is going back to, for example, the Greek words, right? I mean, do you know what the Greek words are for homosexual in those passages? Yeah, it's arsenokoitai and malakoi, right? So arsenokoitai meaning, and see the problem is that arsenokoitai and malakoi don't appear in the rest of the Greek, corpus. So people don't really know exactly what that means. Malakoi actually means soft, people think. And arsenokoitai means man bed. But other than that, a lot of people think that those terms actually meant pederasts or people, relationships that were not sort of consensual or mutual. Okay, so one, people don't really know what those words mean. The Bible may say, oh, it means homosexuals. But if you look at all the English translations over time, it changes every 50 years. So the question is, like, what does that mean? And I think, so in my view, again, it goes back to, there are certain kinds of relationships that, sort of may or may not be healthy or fulfilling of God's role. But to say that one certain word definitely means something, I think is just, from a scholarship perspective, is just wrong. But at the end of the day, it's sort of like, you know what? At the end of the day, if we really take the gospel of grace seriously, I, as much as you, as anyone else, put myself in the hands of God. And I think all we can do is the best and really rely on God's grace. And if we do take God's grace seriously, yeah, I agree. None of us can work our way into heaven. We really rely on God's grace. And I think that's what Paul has to teach us about the gospel. So thank you.
係嗰位男士。
Well, just a small question, a little question. Why is the word queer translated into 酷兒? 酷兒, is a new term for me. What does it really mean in Chinese? 酷 is 殘酷, is it right? But why?
Well, we have one of the world's best translators here, so I'm not just dodging the question. I just so admire Kurt's work. So, I mean, could you maybe say a little bit about that, or would you be willing to? Or okay, or Eric, or no? Well, I mean, but it isn't in the secular world. Do they use queer for queer, or is that just something that's theological
Teresa,
only?
you would like to?
Okay,
yes.
yeah, okay.
Okay, it is. The earliest to have this Chinese translation is from Taiwan. 喺中文其實喺台灣翻譯，佢只不過喺國語 ho 就似嗰個發音。我哋成日都中文譯就係攞嗰個同音嘅啫，所以其實冇乜，即係佢哋都好叻嘅。你睇個字個號其實唔係號型，好 cool 咁咯，都有少少咁嘅意思。
其實反映咗中文呢，我哋華人社會或香港社會其實冇一個字嚟去形容一種咁嘅情況，即係 inclusive 包括咁多種。咁我哋應該要發展自己嘅語言，同埋一個合適嘅字眼，而唔係淨係將個英語翻譯近音，然後成為中文。咁樣呢係一個唔成功嘅本土化咯，咁嚇。咁我覺得其實係我哋係需要 即係做呢方面嘅工作，暫時係未完成嘅，我覺得係。
其實可能Patrick maybe you can explain a little bit the original meaning of why the queer group use the word queer。佢哋有佢哋嗰個處境嘅選擇嘅文化上或者嗰個政治層面上。咁其實酷兒嗰個翻譯真係一個唔係咁本土，但係佢係一個音譯㗎啦嚇，喺台灣嚟講。但係我又覺得我哋可以再將佢本土化嘅。不過呢一個翻譯本身咧，我哋都可以參考佢哋外國嗰個經驗嚟到係引入嚟嘅。咁呢個係一個 process， 我自己覺得係一個過程咯嚇，而唔係只係一個 term 咯嚇。咁不過即係呢個係你可以淨係站喺一個文化嘅塑造嘅一個過程咁去睇，或者喺神學都係有好多一個轉化嘅。其實我哋成個基督教嘅神學都係來自西方㗎啦，係咪啊？咁所以其實呢樣嘢亦都唔係獨一嘅一個問題咯。Anyway，
咁我記得何式凝博士咧，佢有話，如果你話一個本土化嘅 term 咧，酷兒佢話用騎呢嘅。因為騎呢就係即係唔正常啊嘛，通常你一係就正常啦，一係就騎呢，咁佢就用騎呢。不過我覺得香港咧就係就唔可以騎呢啦咁。係，仲有邊位想係？
Okay. Oh, and actually, when I showed my mother some translations of my bio that used the word queer, she's like, "Oh, great! That means cool." Right, like you were saying. So, but thank you for that history. Thank you, Mai Shan.
係呢位係。
我也不知道我该用什么语言来就是回答。我是超超，我来自台湾。然后可以解释一下为什么queer翻作酷儿。其实刚刚郑博士的解释很好，他是 erase the boundary. But no, the usage of queer is quite provocative and challenge to the boundary at all. It is not so romantic. So actually queer is a very dirty term before the revision of queer after 1990s. So no, in Chinese, in Taiwan, we use very dirty term to call them like 怪胎或变态或死玻璃. Those are the dirty terms that used before the queer was introduced to Taiwan. But at the same time, the Hong Kongese Lin Yihua director introduced 同志 as another term to call gay and lesbian or LGBT people in general. But actually, we don't share the comparative or conflict history that happened in the Western, because actually they have a long history about gay movement since the late 1960s and 70s. But actually in Asia, we introduced both terms at the very beginning of 90s. So that's why we have a confusion about that. So maybe some dirty terms used in Hong Kong would be a better term. So that's my... Because actually, no, we cannot romanticize the queer as a term and reduce the power or the power of challenge toward the boundary. We cannot just think, wow, that's a peaceful, that's a lovely term, and we just easily, totally accept that. It is not the essence of queer movement at all. I would interpret in this way. So that's my comment. So my question is, what is the unique side of queer Asian theology? I mean, what is the differences between queer Asian and what is the differences of queer Asian from black queer theology, white queer theology, or at all? Besides the transnational, besides the erase the boundary, if we have any queer Asianness, or do we need this kind of essence of queerness? Thanks.
Right. Wow. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the explanation of the word, and that's really helpful. I think language shapes reality in many ways, and so it's really important to know that history. And you are sort of asking also what is distinctive about queer Asian theologies, is that right? Like, and how it might differ from other theologies, like queer theologies in general, or sort of other ethnic theologies, right? Yeah, it's a great question. So one, buy my book, Rainbow Theology. Oh, you have it. Okay, all right. I'll sign it. Okay, all right. Yeah, good. Thank you. Okay. Well, I think one of the the things that I argue in that book, which I didn't talk about in this lecture tonight, is that I think a gift that LGBT people of color have is being able to see the world in terms of multiplicity and middle spaces and mediation. So in other words, oftentimes I think queer theology, white queer theology, is only focused on sexuality, right? That's sort of the one thing. But because we have like culture, and there's white culture too, but what I'm saying is like to be a minority, especially in the United States, to have to deal with racial and ethnic issues, as well as like, maybe Neo-Confucian or, Taoist or Buddhist issues and interfaith issues and language issues. All these intersections are very challenging. And so it lifts up multiplicity as an important aspect of theological reflection. Same thing with middle spaces. I always have to deal with every morning I wake up and I have to decide, am I Asian today or am I gay today? Maybe not as much here. Like this is why I'm like falling in love with Hong Kong because, I just feel at home. Like, I go out and I don't always feel so different. But, in the U.S., it's like, depending on what space I'm in, if I'm in a queer space, oftentimes I'm seen as an outsider because of racism, right? Like, and this is a difference. Racial ethnic minorities, like African Americans, have their stereotypes. They're also masculine. I'm talking about men now, but sort of masculine, almost hyper masculine. And Asian men. I'm not sure if there are the same stereotypes here in Asia, but in the United States, some queer Asian people have written about Asian men as being bottom. It's almost like the African American man is the phallus, but the Asian American man is the anus. But you know what I mean? Like all these stereotypes, right? And what I'm saying is that you have to deal with those stereotypes on top, racial and ethnic stereotypes, on top of the homophobia. So when I'm in the Asian American community on here, it's sort of like then it's primarily straight, and you have to deal with all the aunties and uncles. When are you going to get married? Even though you're like 44, and you're not going to get married anytime soon. So it's always one side or the other. I think to be queer and Asian is to really live on that center line. Do you see what I'm saying? So the context, the particular context really depends, influences the theological reflection. And it's, I think God saw it and it was good.
Yes, Hope.
Thank you very much for your enlightening lecture. I really enjoyed it. I just have, as I was thinking through your presentation, especially the very radical point of erasing boundaries, I was thinking whether there will come a time when there will also be a different way of looking at the committed relationships. Because right now, marriage is closely identified to very heterosexist kind of structure, right? Relationship between husband and wife, man and woman. So how would that be revisited, re-envisioned by the queer? Will there be a different form later, maybe? I was just wondering, just trying to push the boundaries.
Well, I don't know. I sort of feel like Jesus being trapped by the Pharisees, like either answer, I don't know what perspective you're coming from, right? Because the radical left and the radical right, both, they can ask the same question, but, you get in trouble either way. I mean, my point is, I think the gift that queer theology has about relationships and ethics is that you look at the quality of the relationship and not the form. You can have a heterosexual man-woman for life kind of relationship, but you can have rape within the marriage relationship, right? So just because it's heterosexual marriage doesn't mean that it's good. It's the quality that matters. You can be sinful and still have a heterosexual marriage relationship. Now, before, theology actually believed that you couldn't have rape within a marriage. And happily, we have become more enlightened about that, both from a criminal perspective and from a theological perspective. So what I would say is to worry less about different forms of relationships and actually look at the quality of the relationships. That's what matters. I will say, from a practical perspective, my husband and I have been together for 22 years. We are married in Massachusetts because the state of Massachusetts has marriage laws. But the United States government has 1,000 marriage rights. 1,000 rights that even though we've been together for 22 years and are married in a state, we have no access to those rights. including inheritance rights. So if I were to die tomorrow, Michael would have to pay taxes on on all of our assets. And if he didn't have money to pay our housing taxes, he'd have to sell our home that we've lived in for most of that time together, just because we're not married. So the importance of marriage is that it's not a religious matter. I mean, it is a religious matter in terms of if you care about love, then anyone who cares about love, including Christians, should fight for same-sex marriage rights. Because it is absurd that not to be able to take care of the person you love. I mean, that is a sin. So I think before we talk about alternative forms of relationship, and I'm not saying everyone has to get married, because people on the radical left are saying, well, it's patriarchal, whatever. I mean, you don't want to get married, don't get married. But people who want to get married should have every right to do so. That's the right thing to do. End of sermon. And we'll have just so people know, we're going to wrap up soon, right?
係啦，我諗因為時間關係，我哋而家 take 多2條問題或者回應下。咁嚇，Yvonne先。
好啊，我想澄清翻啲概念嘅，就頭先你嗰啲 slide 咧就話一邊男一邊女啦，即係左手邊男右邊女，左手邊同性戀右邊異性戀咁樣樣。咁而 Queer Theology 就係話要 break 咗 boundary，remove boundary。我想問咧，澄清個 concept 就係話本身我哋人咧本身已經係即係唔係話100%男100%女嘅啦，可能係82啊37咁樣樣分㗎啦。咁呢個 remove 咗 boundary， 呢一個性別啊，呢一啲homosexual 或者係heterosexual 呢啲咁嘅概念咧。即係兩邊啊，即係左手邊右手邊，仲有冇存在價值咧？如果佢存在嘅時候，個價值係點樣樣咧？如果我唔明嘅 ，OK， 就係話我哋 remove 咗 boundary 之後咧，左手邊同右邊兩個 extreme 仲係咪需要存在？如果佢哋需要存在，點解需要存在咧？咁樣樣。
So just so I understand what you're saying, am I correct in understanding that you're questioning why we have even the binaries themselves, like the heterosexual, homosexual categories? Like why do we need them? Is that right?
Okay. What I'm saying was even the boundary in between is removed. Do we still need the two ends? Of the lines. If we need two ends, why?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think, remember the genderbread model, the genderbread man or genderbread person? There's actually several versions of that, and one version says that the binary model with the two ends is actually not a helpful model, that actually what's really helpful is you have sort of asexual people, like there's no sexual orientation and sexual orientation on either end. So I would just say that, I sort of use the binary model as a pedagogical or teaching tool. I think there are other ways of envisioning the spectrum on which sexualities and gender exists. So I'm not sure if that really gets to your question. I just want to affirm that that's not the only way of thinking about things. Okay, so thank you for your question.
係最後一條問題係 Anita。
My name is Anita. Nice to meet you, Patrick.
Thanks. Nice to meet you too.
I'm not so sure whether my question is under your theme, but that lady just started it, so I go further. What do you think about multiple relationship? Because I am a counselor, most of my clients come for couple therapy. Some of the individual friends, they come for their affair relationship out of the marriage. So no matter same-gender relationship or heterosexual relationship, what do you think about the affair part? Can they keep it or just cut it off?
Right. So the question I'm hearing is, what do I think about sort of, alternative relationships, like in terms of affairs or other kinds of things? Well, I think the important thing is actually the ability to speak honestly about the different kinds of relationships that exist. So my lecture is more on queer theology and not on queer ethics. So ethics is a whole other field as to how you apply, in terms of what one lives. I can tell you, though, that sort of being an ordained minister, for 12 years, that whether it's homosexual or heterosexual, what the most devastating thing about relationships are the secrets that we hold. The secrets that we hold against each other, or the secrets are the inability to talk about these relationships. Even people, I think, actually the most conservative churches, I think, have the most destructive kinds of secrets, whether it's addictions or other kinds of things, because people are unable to be honest with their pastor, which is something that they actually should be most honest with. And so I think the real issue is, can we talk about the fact that in straight relationships there are so many affairs and the sex workers, the whole industry that's going on, or serial monogamy that we think of as monogamy, but it's really, sort of that we don't treat our spouses with honesty and dignity, So I think the beauty of queer theology is the ability to actually break silences and to say, look, what are the harms, what are the benefits, and to really be honest and not subscribe to some fairy tale notion of relationships. So I think I really thank you for the work that you do in terms of counseling, and I would encourage you to sort of help change the world in terms of being more honest and the ability to talk about, sort of what's really going on, and not sort of, sometimes we make people demons and we scapegoat them because we're afraid of what really is going on in our lives. We project them onto other people. So, thank you.
好，多謝晒。Okay, so 我哋其實而家嗰個講座都去到尾㗎啦。So Patrick, we're coming to the end of the lecture. Would you like to round this up with a few words or few thoughts?
I think I've done enough, and you guys have been great in terms of sitting here. So thank you to Pearl for moderating, and thank you for our respondents. And
thank you 嚇。咁其實我哋而家咧就會派啲意見書嘅。咁我哋好希望你哋一陣即係用1-2分鐘時間填咗佢，因為呢個對於我哋日後再舉辦一啲公開講座咧係會有幫助。咁仲有咧就係頭先Patrick 都話佢有3本書。就係其實我哋喺出邊都有得賣嘅，咁就第一本 Radical Love 就賣晒啦 ，sold out 嚇 Radical Love。咁不過仲有2本就 From Sin to Amazing Grace， 同埋佢最新嗰本 Rainbow Theology 都有。咁你哋買咗之後咧，阿 Patrick 一陣係佢好願意留低，係如果你需要佢簽名或再同佢傾2句，佢都得嘅。好啦，咁我哋就最後咧就呼籲大家，我哋有個奉獻箱，咁希望大家可以係啦，就臨走嗰陣時咧就支持我哋日後嘅工作。咁而家咧，我哋就想頒翻一啲紀念品同大合照。咁我哋有請九龍佑寧堂嘅黃美鳳牧師上嚟幫我哋頒贈一啲紀念品俾翻我哋啲嘉賓嘅嚇。有請黃牧師，你遞俾啊，首先咧就我哋請鄭書祥博士先啦 ，Patrick， 蒲錦昌，好。係咁，而家我哋就請Bell 啦、蒲牧師同埋Rose， 我哋有少少心意俾。好。咁我哋今晚仲係要好多謝黃慧晶教授嚟幫佢做翻譯，咁仲有係基恩之家嘅 Jason、Kurt 同 Kelvin 嘅。咁黃教授、黃慧晶老師係我哋有少少有張心意卡俾翻你啫。好，咁跟住我哋就會嚟一個大合照。咁請翻你留步。咁頭先所有嘉賓請你哋出翻嚟啦。咁同埋今次呢個Rose、蒲牧師、Patrick，yeah we'll take a big photo，yeah group photo。仲有今次嘅協辦機構QAF 召集人所有人啦九龍人眾樂教會嘅 Grace、基恩之家。 咁不如阿 Jason、Kelvin 同埋阿 Kurt 做代表啦，Angela 係啦，我哋一齊大合照。仲有邊度啊？基督徒學會 Davy 啦，路小教會嘅 David 啦，唔該。好。係好。OK 好。阿善文 Joseph 嘅 Joey， 一陣影。好 OK 好，唔該晒。好啦，咁而家咧就